Hi, my name's Katrine Eisman. In the following program, we're going to be using Adobe Photoshop to restore and retouch a great number of images. The problems we're going to tackle in this session are how to correct tone, exposure, contrast, and also work with color, doing color balance and color correction. In all these exercises, we're going to be working with antique and contemporary images, and we're really going to take some pretty sad examples and make them look great with a few clicks of the mouse by taking advantage of the power in Photoshop. Now, I suggest that you watch this tape one time through. Then, if you want to work along with me, you can go to my website, which is at www.digitalretouch.org, and you can download about 80% of the files that I'm going to be working with. Now, the other 20%, I didn't have permission to post them on the web, so what you'll need to do is find images with a similar problem. But all in all, there's a lot of files there, and we have a lot of material to cover, so let's just get started right now. What we're going to look at now is how to correct tone and exposure with Adobe Photoshop. Now, when you start working with any photos, you want to get your tone and your exposure right first. I mean, just imagine if the image was really very, very dark, you wouldn't even be able to see if there were color problems or if there were some issues that you needed to retouch. So always get the tone and the exposure right. And to do that, we'll be using adjustment layers, primarily with levels and curves, and I'll also show you some very, very interesting lighting and masking techniques so that you can selectively open up certain image areas. Now, there's one problem with Photoshop, and that is it's extremely powerful, meaning you could mean very, very well, but you could actually ruin your image data while you're working. Now, what I've created here is just a little black to white blend. I want to illustrate how Photoshop can, when it moves around data, what actually happens. So, I have this grayscale here, and let's just pretend that it looks too dark. So what you might do is you would go to your layers palette, and you would add a new adjustment layer, and we'll use levels to do that. So, here's the histogram, and I'll be talking a lot about the histogram in a moment, of this grayscale. We have our darks on the left, midtones, and highlights. So let's say I just want to make this grayscale lighter. So I'll move my midtone to the left to make it lighter. And I go, yeah, that looks great. Now someone else comes and looks at the file and go, nope, this is really much too dark. So what they're going to do is double click on that histogram again, and then let's make that darker. And it's like, oh, that looks a lot better. So to you and me right now on the screen, that file actually looks the same. The thing with working with adjustment layers, which is actually great, is I haven't really affected the layer underneath it until I apply that change by flattening the file. So I come over to my layers palette and I'm going to flatten this image. And now let's look at what that histogram looks like now. So I will come over here and go down to levels, and it's when I start seeing these types of white spikes in here, that's when I start getting very, very worried. So what I just tried to illustrate with that, with two simple moves, what's going to happen is you're changing the distribution of your tones. And if you do that a lot to an image, you'll start getting a lot of these spikes, often with even larger bands than that. And what can happen when you make a print is you'll get what's called banding. And the banding are these steps, especially in the shadows, of black to very dark to lighter gray. And it can really make the image look like it's breaking up. So all I want to say with that is when you do tonal correction in Photoshop, you really want to do it very carefully. And if you can get the exposure right before you take the picture, or in front of the lens, as we say, that's always the best place to do it. The next place you want to get your exposure right is when you're sitting down and working with your scanner. So if you can spend a few minutes with your scanner interface, get the exposure right there, you'll be way ahead of the game. in the following exercise, I want to add snap and contrast back to this image, which is faded. The blacks are flat and the highlights are white. And I'll do that with an image adjustment levels layer. So here we have this very faded photo. And what happens when things fade over time, you'll see that the highlights have gotten very gray and very muddy. Now, if you can't see that on your computer screen, what you want to be very sure of is always to have your info palette open. If you can't find it on your desktop, just go Window, Show Info, and the info palette will jump up. What's good about the info palette is you can use it to measure tones. So even if you can't see if a white is getting blown out, you can measure it right here. So this is a grayscale image, so I'm going to change my readout to grayscale, and you notice the readout went into K, which stands for black. And right here, this white is going to print as an 18% gray, which is very dingy for a white. So that's one thing that I'm worried about this file, that white's going to be really gray. And now let's look at the shadow areas. They're back here, and they've gotten lighter. So over time, what's going to happen to these antique files are the whites will get muddy and go down and get less bright, and the blacks will actually get lighter. So you're getting an image with less and less contrast. What we want to do is, with a few clicks of the mouse, add that original contrast right back. So I'm going to come over to my Layers palette, and here, let me show you what I'm doing. This is the original, and this is where we're going to go. So with one click, you'll have from this faded image to this image with snap. Now I'll throw that layer away so that we can work on this together. Under my Layers palette, I'll drop down to the image adjustment icon and add a levels adjustment layer. Now, what you see here is the original histogram. And you see what I'm seeing right here, this big white gap? There should actually be dark information there. And there's none because that black is so faded. So all I need to do is move this black slider in to where the majority of that black information starts. And I'm going to do the same thing with my white slider. Move it to where the majority of that white information starts. Okay? Now while you're doing that, you can even use the info palette to check your work. So there's the info palette. You just hit the F8 key on your keyboard and it will show the info palette. And as you can see, I've gone from that muddy 18% to an 8%, which will print very nicely. And I'll show you how you can start learning what that's going to print like, because we'll make a test strip where you can measure it. So let me click OK to this. Now look at that. That's before and that's after. So by dragging in your black point to where the majority of the black started, and then the same thing with the white, dragging that in, I'm redefining the black point and the white point for Photoshop, and the image has the original snap to it. Once you've adjusted images white point and black point, many times you'll also want to adjust the image's midtone to lighten or darken the image up, something we'll also do with the Levels image adjustment layer. Notice, I always like working in full screen mode. So what I can do is I can either click down here on the toolbar, which will bring me into full screen mode, or what I prefer is actually just hit the F on the keyboard, and I'm going to go Command for Mac or Control PC plus to get that image a little larger. So here, this image has the same problem, so I'm going to show you how we can go from this flat image to this image that has a lot more snap to it, but add one more tool to our Levels toolbox. So, on the Layers palette, I'm going to drop down the image adjustment layer, drag down to Levels. And here's the same problem. Now the good thing about working with Photoshop, once you've done one technique, you'll get much faster and faster. And so I can apply the same technique, move that black slider in, move that white slider in. And now if I look at this image, it's still too dark. Now that's a visual call on my part. And that's one of the things that you want to practice when you're doing any kind of restoration or retouching. You're going to practice your visual memory and your visual skills. And no one can really tell you, well, that's right or wrong, because I doubt any of you were here when that picture was taken. So what I'm going to do is just lighten this up a tiny little bit, and notice how that background starts coming into play. You don't want things to go too dark, because when images get too dark, there's nothing for the viewer's eye to look at, and they're not interesting. So always try to maintain some shadow detail. I'm going to click OK, and let me just turn that layer on and off so you can see how effective that was. So there's before, and there's after. So once again, I used the black slider, moved it to where the majority of the information started, and the same thing with the white slider, and your mid-tone slider, that's responsible for your exposure. Moving it to the left, some people also call it your tone. So moving it to the left will lighten the image. That's how I remember it, left, light. Moving it to the right will darken things down. Something in this case that I don't want to do. And once again, using my info palette by hitting F8, I can control exactly those whites are going to print with an 8% dot, which is just perfect. Now, when you're restoring pictures, most likely you're going to want to be able to make a print of it, be it in a magazine, newspaper, or to your inkjet printer. And if you look at an image on screen, it'd be very helpful to know how are the tones and the print going to translate onto your paper. So what you want to do is you want to learn how to measure the values in the image and see how they're going to get translated in terms of tone. So here's an image that I retouched. And I can look at it, and it's all done. And I can read the area off the little boy's shoulder. And on the info palette in K, because it's a grayscale image, it says it's going to print as a 10% dot. All right? So far that doesn't really mean much, does it? Let's go into the trees. Okay, those trees are going to be at 77%. And part of the boat here is 30%. But what does that really mean? And how can that help you visualize what the print's going to look like? Well, until you get to feel what these tones are going to print like, it's very helpful for you to build a test target that you can put on the side of a print, print it out and study and see how a tone is going to translate onto your print, onto the paper. So what I do is I like making a new test strip, and I'll just go File, New, and you can make a fairly long and narrow test strip. So I have 10-inch paper, so I'll make a 10-inch by a 2-inch print. I like upping the resolution a little bit, so I'll go to 150. And you can keep it on grayscale, because right now we're just going to be looking for tone. We're not talking about color yet. And you know, if you want to, you can even name it test strip. Okay, and what Photoshop will give you is a very long file. And what you want to do is get your blend tool and choose the black to white blend. If you don't have Photoshop 6, working with 5, just set your foreground color and your background color to default, black to white. Now, what's very important when you make this test strip with the blend is that you uncheck dither in the options bar. That's very important so that we get a clean test strip. And I'll show you how we're going to do that in a moment. So I'll start my very left edge. I'm holding down the Shift key, which will force Photoshop to make a straight blend, straight line, and I'll go all the way to the right side. So I have a perfect gray to white blend. Now, in order to give myself steps, I'm going to follow the scheme of the Kodak 21 step wedge. So I will now go Image, Adjust, Posterize. And what this will do is it gives you an interface that asks you how many steps do you want to break this test target up into. The default is usually 4. Mine is set to 21. And I'm going to say OK. And now you can see what Photoshop did. It gave me a test strip that goes from black through the grays. And if you watch the info palette here, I'm on black, that's 100%. And you can see it goes up in perfect 5% increments. And what I can do is I can take this test strip, and I'll just take my Move tool, and I can drag it on top of that picture. In this case, the test strip is too large, but that doesn't matter because Photoshop will use the large image data, and I can actually scale this test strip right on down to match the size of the print. And now if I make a print, I'll be able to see, okay, here's a 0% dot. Here on the bottom right, that's a 5% dot. This is a 10% dot. Okay, remember, his shoulder was printing as a 10% dot also. So what I can do is I can start visualizing that's what a 10% dot is going to look like. So I'll show you how I set up this file when I want to make a test strip. I'll just very quickly step back in the history because it's sitting right here. That when I want to make a test print, I'll actually add canvas size to the size of my file, put in the test strip. Now these numbers are nice and slick, but you'd have to add those on your own, just using the type tool. But I can now see how the printer is going to actually print all of these values. And that helps me see how the tones are falling and how they're going to start printing. And after a while, you actually get used to it. You get used to reading the K values off of an image. Oh, that's 8%, that's 10%. I know what that's going to print like. And then you get a lot more confidence in what you're doing and using the info palette with your monitor. In the following exercise, we'll use a levels adjustment layer and set a new black point and a new white point to add snap and contrast back to an image very quickly and very easily. So this image, taken around the same time period, has also faded over time. And I put it on my flatbed scanner and I scanned it. That's what these little dark corners are here. That's actually the lid of my scanner. And if I come to levels, let me show you where we're going to go with this picture. From very flat to an image that has snap. But we're going to use a different technique this time. So I'll throw this adjustment layer away so we're starting with the original file. I'm going to add the levels adjustment layer. Now I get this question a lot. Should I use levels or curves? And to be quite frank, the answer is yes. What I do is I use levels to adjust the tone and the exposure. And then when I want to fine tune the contrast, I'll move into curves. But you should be working with what you're comfortable with. I like levels because I can see the histogram, and that helps me visualize where the image is. In fact, when I started working with Photoshop, I used levels for the first 3 years before I even touched curves. So work with what you're comfortable with, levels or curves. What you don't want to work with, let me cancel out of here for a moment so you'll see what I will never work with, and I don't want you to work with either, is brightness contrast. Because these sliders here and brightness and contrast, they don't give you any real control. I just now did plus 25 brightness, but it's 25 of what? There's no relationship to what's actually going on in the image. So brightness and contrast should be avoided at all cost. Also, the math used in brightness contrast just is not as good as levels and curves. So from now on, no brightness and contrast. So let me go back to levels, and I could use the same technique of using the sliders to push up this information and catch this information. But I want to show you another way that you can use levels. And that's by using these eyedroppers. What these eyedroppers will do is they will let you define a new white point, a new neutral point on a color image, and a new black point. Now, if I did that, I would be defining a new black point as exactly 0, 0, 0, because that's how we're going to measure it in digital terms, from 0, 0, 0 to 255, 255, 255. The problem is if you have your blacks at 0 and your whites at 255, if you try to make a print, let's say with a white that is pure digital white, you're actually going to be seeing the white of the paper that you're printing on. And you actually want to avoid that because it's too harsh, it's too bright. So what I want to do is set new target points for the white point and the black point. Now, I'm going to give you some general recommendations. And if you really want to fine-tune these settings, you have to be aware that it's going to depend on what kind of paper you're printing on. For example, if you're printing on newsprint, which is very absorbent, your values are going to be much lower. but you want to talk to your printer or your pre-press expert to find out the specific values. Now, when I go out to an inkjet print, which I have at home, I use the values for RGB of 245, 245, and 245. If you understand printing, you'll see my values here have changed. They're 322. Many times you'll use the standard 522, and you see these values have changed. They will change depending on how you have your Photoshop color settings set up. So we're going to go 245, 245, and you'll see here there's a slight bit of tonality in that white. I'm going to click OK. Now I'll do the same thing with the black. Don't want to print pure black. So for my inkjet printer, I'm going to go 8, tab, 8, tab, 8. And it's a very subtle difference. But what that will do is it won't make it a pure black, which uses a lot of ink. So now I can come into this picture and I can look at it and I can decide, what do I want to be black? What do I want to be white? So if I look at this picture, let me start with the black point first. I'm going to click on my black eyedropper, and back here in the shadows, these black windows, which are at the interior of the house where there's absolutely no light, I'm going to make that black. Now that looks very, very dark. Don't worry. I'm going to use the white eyedropper to define a new white point. And now look at how that image is popping. Now once again, always check your work with the eyedropper tool and the info palette. And you see what's happening with this white dress. If I look at the info palette, it's actually getting very, very white. And you can look at your histogram and look where that white eyedropper forced that white point to. You can just back right off. So you can work with the white eyedropper and the slider together. And I'm going to click OK. And let's look at there's before, there's after. Before and after. What I really like about image adjustment layers is you can always just double click right on the adjustment layer icon and fine tune any adjustment to your liking. And then I like turning them on and off to see a before and after, to see if I'm going in the right direction. Now, in worst case scenario, what I do is if I don't like where I'm going, I'll just throw the entire layer away and start over. Because sometimes it's just easier to start over and with a fresh eye and keep going. When you're working with old images, sometimes it's very hard to even know where to set a white point or a black point. I want to show you here how to use a threshold adjustment layer, and Photoshop will show you this is where white should go, this is where black will go, and you can use that information to add contrast back to an image. Now, take a look at this image. Where's the white point? Where's the black point? That's right. I have no idea, and we get to guess, which usually isn't a good way to work. So let's use Photoshop to show us the white point and the black point. And what I do with that is I go to the Adjustment Layers palette and I drop down to Threshold. And what Threshold does, you can see, is it divides that image into exactly black and white without any gray tones. But what's interesting about Threshold is you have this histogram, which is showing you where that tonal distribution is. I'm going to move this slider all the way to the right, and look what's happening to that file. It's turning completely white. Right? So there's no information. And now I'm going to move this slider back to the right, and I'm looking for the beginning of black clumps. Oh, there, I see one right up here. Let's zoom in on it. So that's the first dark value that Photoshop found. I'm going to go up a little bit more, and I'm actually in the woman's hair right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click OK. Now, of course, the image doesn't look good, but what you want to do is, in your toolbar, we have the eyedropper, and nested under the eyedropper is the color sampler tool. Now, what you can do with the color sampler tool, I can use it, and I'll just put a mark right on where that black point is. Now, don't worry, I haven't ruined the image yet. See, I can just turn that off, and look what I have. I have a little note of this is where Photoshop found the first black. So I'm going to turn this threshold layer back on, and I had to zoom out because I'm going to double click on it. Now let's find where Photoshop says the real white information is. So I come all the way over here, the image is turning black, and I'll start using my mouse to move this slider down, and I can see at the very bottom of the frame that there's some black. So I'm going to click OK, get my second color sampler, and just make a mark on where Photoshop found white. So what you can do now is turn off that threshold layer, because that's just used for production. You don't need it anymore. If you wanted to, you could just throw it right out. We don't want it. And now I will add a levels adjustment layer. Got the same histogram, and now I'll use that white eyedropper and click right on top of where Photoshop said there was real white. Okay, and look what happened. I didn't get clipped. And now I'm going to go to where Photoshop said was the real black. And I can even zoom in, even when I'm in the interface, by using the space bar and the command key or space bar and control key on the PC. And now take the black and click right on that black point. So let's click OK and zoom out. And now look at this file. There's the before, and here's after. And what's great about this technique is I didn't need to guess. Photoshop showed me where the white point was with threshold, and it showed me where the black point was. And then I can just come in with levels or with curves and use that white eyedropper, click on the white part, click on the black, I'm done. And I'll admit it, I use this technique when I get tired, when I don't want to make any decisions. It's like, I've had it, threshold, nail it, done. Now, one tiny little thing you want to do when you're done with this technique is see how Photoshop keeps those eyedropper color settings right here? They can get really irritating and they'll stay with the file. So what I like to do is go to the toolbar, drag down the color sampler, and you'll notice on the options bar there's a big clear button. Just click on it and Photoshop takes those color samplers away. Because once you're done with the threshold, you don't need them anymore. In fact, you can throw away your threshold, and it was just used to find the black point and the white point. So by using your threshold to find the black point and the white point, and then using levels to actually remap them, you've got a great technique that'll clean up an image in absolutely no time at all. Now, so far I've showed you all these techniques on, antique images, but you can use all these techniques on your contemporary images. If you have images that are underexposed or flat, you can use the exact same techniques. Doesn't matter if it's a 19th century image or a 21st century image. Very often you'll be asked to salvage very underexposed or very overexposed images. In this exercise, we'll work with an image that's very, very dark, but we're going to use an image adjustment layer in combination with the blending mode in order to save the exposure and lighten the image right up. This picture is just way too dark. I mean, there was daylight in this picture, but somehow the person that was taking the picture really messed up the camera settings. So as a photographer, I can see there's about at least 2 to 3 stops under exposure here. So I really want to lighten this picture up. And what I'm going to do is use a technique that I've developed because, to be quite honest with you, I am a lazy Photoshopper. So being a lazy Photoshopper means you want Photoshop to do the work for you. And the more Photoshop can do, the more fun you'll have. So let's go back to the image adjustment layer palette. And I'm going to, this time I'll use a curve. I'm going to show you something pretty sneaky. I'm going to come over here, drag down to curves, and do absolutely nothing except click OK. I know you're probably wondering why. Because look, here's the before and there's the after. Now, if you noticed a difference in that file, I would be very worried if I were you, because I've done absolutely nothing. But Photoshop has, with all the layers, a number of blending modes that you can find right in your layers palette. And these are complete lifesavers when you're trying to restore and retouch and rescue exposure. And this group of 5 right here, multiply, screen, overlay, soft light, and hard light. These are the ones you can use to correct exposure. Now, you don't need to memorize the math between all of these because it's really boring. Now, just as a nutshell, multiply always darkens the image. Well, this image is already too dark, so I'm not going to use multiply. Screen is the opposite of multiply, and it will lighten all your images. So let's see what screen does. It's like, bingo, no work. That image has already been opened up a great deal. In fact, let me turn this layer on and off. See that? That's before and that's after. What's great about these blending modes, and I'll continue talking about these, overlay, soft light, and hard light are actually a combination of screen and multiply. And what they'll do is they'll darken the darks and lighten the lights to varying degrees. So depending on the effect that you want, you would experiment between overlay, soft light, and hard light. I don't want to darken the darks in this case, so I'm going to stick with screen. What's great about these blending modes is you can use them to get into the ballpark, to go from very dark to, let's just call it acceptable. And then what you can do is still double click on the adjustment layer, bring up your curves interface, and you can come into your curves interface, and I'm here in my midtones, right in this midpoint, and just by pulling that up, I'm going to be lightening that image overall, but the screen blending mode is still helping me. So by using screen, I got at least half of my work done. We all have pictures that are overexposed, or in other words, are just too light. We can use image adjustment layers and the blending mode of multiply to darken those images down to give them a little more saturation and contrast very quickly and very easily. Now, this image was shot with a medium format film by a professional photographer, and the exposure is way off. He's completely overexposed this film. Now, one thing with Photoshop